Welcome to Live with the Author. My name is Amanda Goodwin, and I'm the co-editor of Reading Research Quarterly. And I have here with us one of our wonderful special issue authors. Welcome, Tim Shanahan.
Hi, Amanda. Happy to be here.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. I always love the conversations that we have. They always teach me something. And for those of you who are interested, you can find Tim's manuscript in our special issue on the science of reading, and it's entitled "What Constitutes a Science of Reading Instruction" by Timothy Shanahan. So, Tim, tell me a little bit about how you got into this topic.
How did I get into it? I've been in this field for more than 50 years at this point. So I've been doing this for a
That's
long
awesome.
time. But like a lot of folks who came into it paying attention to research, didn't necessarily know what that meant, didn't really know research deeply. I did my PhD work and started doing my studies and so on. But I had a very narrow and specific idea of science in this field. By the 1990s, however, people were really trying to set policy in reading on the basis of research. And I ended up being put on some of those scientific panels and had to really almost re-educate myself to know a heck of a lot more about research than I really did then, even though I was a researcher. So things like the National Reading Panel, the National Early Literacy Panel, some of the advisory roles I played with governments and so on and so forth, those really deepened my understanding of what was needed and how people in different fields and parents and policymakers think of research, because they think of what we do as very different than what we often think of.
Well, and that's so fascinating. I mean, and that was such a key role that you played on those panels, and I'm sure gave you a unique perspective. And someday I want to hear all about those discussions even more. And it kind of, as you're talking about the science and what different people think about the science, how would you define the science of reading?
I think most of the real discussion these days is actually about the science of reading instruction, which is a subset of the science of reading. To me, the science of reading is the entire universe of systematic study of all aspects of literacy. How it's learned, certainly, but also how it's used, what it is that people read. And so, if somebody does a study of adults' reading habits during the pandemic, I would say that's part of the science of reading. Somebody does a study of how did women in the 1930s use journals in their daily lives to get through their days. I would argue that's part of the science of reading. What happens now, though, is people grab a little subset of those studies and say, this is the science of reading, and these are the ones we want to apply to instruction. And I think when you get to the applying to instruction, then I think there's some real rules and requirements about what it takes to be a science of reading instruction.
I think that's the perfect segue to my next question, which is, how does your article add to the science of reading?
Well, I think one of the things when you look at the public discussion of these ideas, because again, that's very different than the way it's talked about, say, within the field, even among people who strongly disagree with each other about some of these issues within the field, still talk about it much more similarly than, if you look in the New York Times or you go to Congress and talk to those folks or a group of parents. It's a good deal of the discussion today of science of reading is essentially taking some really cool studies about how text is processed, how words are processed in the brain, how people how little people figure out the statistical properties of language so that they can, come up with the right pronunciations of words quickly and easily, and so it doesn't get in the way of their comprehension and so on and so forth. And, you look at those studies and you go, oh, I'm going to translate those to teaching. And so what I was really trying to make the point is those kinds of studies can be extremely important for either giving us ideas about teaching or for maybe confirming some of the instructional studies that we have. But ultimately, if you're going to apply these to children, especially to kids like I work with in poverty areas and that kind of thing, frankly, you can't go on the science of reading. You really have to go on a science of reading instruction. You have to depend on studies where people actually try to teach kids things to see whether it works. There are so many wonderful ideas out there, and so many of those ideas actually don't work, or we don't know how to make them work. I was reading today in another field. In fact, it was New Yorker magazine. They were writing about studies of sugar and the taste of sugar and how people are trying to come up with other kinds of sugars that won't give you calories and so on. And they have this terrific idea that if you could change the shape of the sugar molecule, it'll still taste sweet to people, but it won't actually be digested, and therefore we won't get fat if we eat all the candy we want to. Cool idea. And it might even be right, but they've been banging at it now for 50 years trying to make it practical.
Right.
They don't have any trouble doing that. That doesn't seem strange to scientists in those kinds of fields. Whereas in reading, if somebody says, wow, there's this really cool brain study, and gee, the way a word is processed is close to this other part of the brain, and so maybe there's this connection. Let's turn that into some instruction that we can sell to schools next semester.
Right, and without studying it. And I think your point is that we actually need to study it to figure out whether it actually works.
So when I was director of reading in the Chicago public schools and was responsible for 437,000 children and 26,000 teachers, I pledged that I was going to mandate some things, but I would never mandate anything that didn't have a substantial amount of instructional science behind it, showing that people were able to make whatever I was saying work, not just once, but again and again and again. That doesn't guarantee we could make it work, but it sure raises the odds.
Right. And even there, I was kind of thinking that idea of context. And so, it's make it work, but with whom, under what conditions?
Absolutely.
And so, really having the science of reading instruction include those contextual factors.
Yeah, in fact, that's where I get a little worried about all this talk about the science of reading or scientific-based reading research. And I've certainly been a big proponent of a lot of that. And yet I think for a lot of teachers, when they hear that, principals and curriculum directors, they hear that language and they think if you buy this program or if you teach that, whatever that thing is, automatically the kids do better. And they don't get that in the studies, people worked really hard to make that phonics program work or to teach those comprehension strategies to the point where they were actually effective.
Or they had smaller groups that came in while the teacher was managing the rest of the class.
Exactly. Or the professor who came up with a wonderful curriculum was the one teaching it, and he knew it inside and out the way that a regular classroom teacher just isn't going to have the time to study it and to understand why this word was selected and not that word.
Or how it links to other programs as well.
Exactly. And so to me, the science of reading instruction has to be, what have you made work? Who have you made it work with? What did you have to do to make it work? Have you been able to make it work on scale? How reliable is the finding? Which means even if you just get a good instructional study, that doesn't necessarily mean you should be trying to put that into classrooms nationwide or across your school district. We might not know enough about it to actually do it well so that it would actually serve children.
And so that makes me wonder, based off of your study, what should teachers do tomorrow?
What should teachers do tomorrow? I think teachers are told to do an awful lot. And I think that they're often told to do it on the basis of research. And I think teachers should need to learn to ask some questions that they don't. Now, you are at a Research One university, one of the certainly best in the world. I'm at a Research One university. I got to tell you, even when I look at people at our Research One universities, I don't think the teachers are learning enough about research to be able to ask questions that would protect them and more importantly, protect the children they're responsible for. And so being able to ask the question of, who was this tried with?
Right.
And how big was the effect? And has anybody else tried this? And did they
What
get
was
the
the
same
context?
effect?
How big were the groups? What was happening?
Exactly. Exactly. And you know, not necessarily to be obstreperous and to say, I'm not going to cooperate in this, but perhaps to say, what's it going to take to make this work here? What are
And
we
that
going to have to do?
and that seems to be the key question. What's it going to take to make this work here? Why did it work in the context it did? And is my context similar enough, or what do I need to do differently
And
to?
all of those kinds of questions that you're asking require that you actually try this stuff out in real classrooms. You see, so much of what we go on these days, in fact, just last week, I wrote a blog about, there's a new study out, a correlational study showing that schools that teach more social studies have higher reading achievement, but the schools that teach more reading don't necessarily have it. Well, it's just a correlational study is the way I look at it. Well, they're touting this as, see, this proves that everybody should increase social studies. And that kind of a study, you don't know what the impact would be really if you increased the amount of social studies instruction. And so while I think it's really important that we increase what kids learn in school, that they're not coming away with enough knowledge of their social world and their natural world. And I think that all should increase. The notion that if you just cut back on reading instruction and teach more social studies, you'll get higher reading achievement is an interesting theory. And the
Gotta put it in
correlation
practice. We gotta check it out.
the correlation is provocative, but it's not ready for prime time because it doesn't, there isn't a science of reading instruction answer on that. People haven't actually done that yet.
Yeah, although I'd say the part that people have been doing, and in the Science of Reading special issue, there's an article on the idea of building knowledge and language knowledge simultaneously. And there's been multiple randomized control studies of that kind of thing. And so we have some evidence that teaching knowledge and language as part of your instruction is effective. But I think it's still that question of, this works.
Right.
And so how does this work, and will this work in my context? And when you're thinking about that school that is doing so much better with social studies, is it because they're fitting this kind of model of teaching knowledge? And what kind of model is the other school using?
There are all kinds of reasons why correlations might be significant, including it's just random error.
Or including there's just different degrees of quality of teachers, because you're saying it's a study of two schools, or maybe it's also that there's different programs going on at these schools.
Absolutely. Again, there's so many. And that's why in most fields that are science-based, and you think of engineering, you think of medicine and those kinds of fields, they don't take a qualitative study or a correlational study or a study that suggests that something could possibly work and then run to market with it. They actually have to try it out and see if they can make it work and under what circumstances they can make it work. And I think we should be held to the same standard. I think.
I love it. And the funniest part is, when I go out to schools and they ask us to help them choose curriculum, or, when I'm trying to look at research behind my children's curricula that they're learning from, I can't find the RCT trials for those. They're citing that phonological awareness matters. So let's put it in. And so I do think there's an important piece. And I think what you're saying is, and we have this in our special issue, is that there is a lot of research on instruction, and specifically taking those correlational studies and trying it out in instruction, noticing that social studies mattered. So let's see if we can teach knowledge as part of reading instruction and see what the impact is.
Absolutely. But those are the kinds of things. So in my article, what I do is I show a lot of ideas that people thought were terrific. They sound stupid now to us, but people 50 years ago, 20 years ago, thought they were wonderful ideas. And they say, I think kids have different learning styles. I know my daughter learns this way and my son, and I'm sure that must make a big difference in learning. So let's come up with a curriculum that will sell to everybody. When you actually try that out, you go, well, gee, that doesn't work. Well, what about left-handedness? I think there are more kids who have reading trouble or left-handed. It must have something to do with that. What if we make them all right-handed? That'll fix it. Well,
Right.
We look at those now with horror, but at the time people thought, well, that's what science says. Not understanding there's a difference between those scientific findings, and yes, indeed, there are more left-handers who have trouble reading for some reason. That's not untrue. And yet the idea that you can intervene and make them right-handed and that'll fix their reading has not panned out so well.
Right. So, Tim, what does your study mean for principals and policymakers?
I think principals and policymakers get pushed by, whatever the new shiny thing is. They see an article that says there's research that says that rapid automatized naming is one of the most important skills in reading. And certainly by correlational evidence and consistency of finding and size of correlation and all that, it's obviously extremely important. And there's not a single study that suggests that we even know how to teach that, or how that we could raise that, and that if we raised it, it would actually change anything for kids' readers. In fact, most of the people who've done work on it don't even believe you could teach it, and yet you'll see that'll show up as some curriculum that'll sweep,
right?
Absolutely, and it'll sweep your state. And so they've got to be much more critical. Not cynical, but skeptical. That, just because somebody, even from a great university, says you should do it, you should be asking the question again, those questions of where have you tried this? How has this worked? Why haven't you been
Will it
able
work for my context? And what does it have to be combined with? Seems like a really important question as well.
And so wondering why, for example, when somebody's marketing something like that and they say, gee, our program is used by the highest achieving schools in the city, therefore you can see it works. That doesn't prove it works. That just tells you that it was appealing to certain kinds of populations that, and so, asking those questions, you should wonder why that study wasn't published in a place like Reading Research Quarterly.
And so I think there you're saying that we do know things that work.
Oh, we know a lot of things.
Like use what we know that works, yes, and really think about, does it work for my context? Absolutely.
There are areas of reading. Let's go back 20 years. Let's go to the National Reading Panel. Clearly, there have been studies done over the last 20 years that strengthen the findings there, because there have been new studies done that add to it. But at the time, there were 51 studies showing that if you taught young children phonemic awareness, they made more rapid progress in reading. There were 38 studies like that on phonics. There were more than 40 studies like that on vocabulary, more than 200 studies like that on teaching reading comprehension strategies. And one of the things that starts to happen is you say, well, wait a minute. Somebody taught phonics in this place and it worked. And then somebody in another place tried it and they made it. And 38 times people did that well enough that it got into refereed journals. I bet we could make that work.
It's going to work.
And so it's that kind of thing that folks need to know, to look to say, well, how often does this happen and how consistently? There are times where, gee, we've got 10 studies on something. 5 of the times it worked, 5 of the times it didn't. It can work, clearly, but I don't.
Under what circumstances does it work, or in combination with what?
It gets much more important when you have a fairly a somewhat unreliable finding. Gee, the conditions must be making a big difference there. Might not be making a big difference in the 200 studies on reading comprehension strategies, but it's probably making a huge difference on the 5 studies on what the XYZ program. So we better pay attention to that. It strikes me that one thing that should be happening, policymakers should be concerned about. I think that every graduate program in the country in reading and for school administrators and so on, school leadership programs, should all have at least one course in reading and interpreting research. It's not common. I'd love to tell you, oh yeah, in all the Research One universities, that's what we do. You can't get a teaching certificate at our school with it. It just isn't true.
Right. There's so much to teach. It's so.
And if we're not getting that done, the places that don't really do a lot of research certainly aren't going to get it done.
Well,
Uh,
and so what I'm hearing from you is just this critical lens. We have a science of reading instruction. We need to call it that. We need
mhm.
to make sure that the findings in the sort of broader science of reading are tested. And we really need to ask this question is, how did this work? Under what conditions? Why did this work?
Absolutely.
Is this going to work here?
And
So
those other studies matter, but they matter only in conjunction to those things that you can actually make work
well,
for.
and they matter in like setting up ideas to make work. So I mean, they seem to
Absolutely.
be really important fuel.
Yeah.
Like we have, unfortunately, we don't have it all figured out. If we
Well,
did, right, everybody would be achieving as we want them to be. So we still need more.
oh
But
yeah. A good deal of what's talked about right now as science of reading in the press is around phonics. And the studies, the instructional studies for a long time have been very overwhelming. Teaching phonics is really helpful to kids in kindergarten or first grade learning to read. It speeds them along. There's just no question at this stage that that's beneficial. That said, these studies that they're citing often are explaining why that is, why it might help kids to process. They don't tell you how to teach it. They don't tell you what to
the
teach,
sequence,
but
like
they do give you some reason for, oh, the reason why those 38 studies are finding positive effects for teaching kids to sound out words might be because the way the brain is processing that information, it might be more similar, so it might be facilitating that. That's nice to know. That's not a bad thing, and that certainly connects to that science of reading instruction. But what if you reversed it? What if you got that study showing how the brain processed that first? You wouldn't be ready to take that into schools, where if you didn't know why it worked, but you knew that it worked, you actually might take that into schools.
what works matters, right?
What works matters.
Think of the What Works Clearinghouse. So Tim, what does your study say for parents?
For parents, I think it suggests that the schools are at times not necessarily doing what's best for kids. That frankly, at times they get pulled by the sales routines, at times by tradition, at times by the loudest person in the room, and that they've got to be careful. I guess if their kids are going to school and seem to be learning well and the kids are happy, maybe you don't have to worry too much. But if your kids aren't doing well, uh, it could be, that the schools are doing everything they can, but it also could be, frankly, the schools really aren't doing the right things, and you're going to have to get in there and ask some questions and push for your youngsters to get some help. Um, One of the things that comes up, a lot of folks like me, in my article, I point out that in some of these articles on science of reading, phonics is mentioned more than 80 times, and the other aspects of reading are mentioned once, which might explain why so much of it is focused on phonics. But there are also studies showing that a lot of our universities aren't providing much training in phonics instruction for pre-service teachers. And so for a parent, they're looking and saying, I assume the school district is going to do the best things for my kids. That isn't necessarily true. People aren't necessarily following that science. So we can get upset. Gee, they're pushing the phonics too much, but we're not explaining, well, why is it that so many of these young teachers are coming out saying, I didn't get any training in that, or I got 1 hour of training in that in a 30-hour class, or
I'm hearing you say like be critical consumers
be
and really
critical
think
consumers.
about what's working for your kid and think carefully about what's being done if you see
Yep.
any problems. And
Yep.
I'm also hearing you say that there are no magic bullets.
There are
So don't
definitely.
just think that if you read a study or if a friend said, "Oh, this program's going to work," be critical about it.
You've got to watch what's going on, not be afraid of asking questions, because again, a lot of folks either don't know, or sometimes they're making decisions for reasons that aren't in your child's best interest. You don't I'm certainly not saying try to undermine your school district or argue with them on everything they do, but I am saying watch how your child is doing. Don't just trust that everything's going to be fine if you send them to school. If you're sending your youngster to a dentist and the kid keeps saying, but my teeth hurt, I might find a new dentist, or I might go and ask some questions of my dentist. I wouldn't just trust that, well, I take him to the dentist twice a year and the dentist says everything's fine. So I don't see any reason to,
Well, and so it's sort of being an advocate, but maybe also being a partner and saying like, all right, why is this? What's going on? Let's be critical together, or let's figure out a solution.
yeah, kids do best. I mean, one thing that we know from qualitative studies is kids do best in environments where they think all the adults in the environment are on their side and care about them. And they do less well when they think that the school wants one thing and the parents want something else, and they feel pulled by it. They don't quite know where to where to land on that. And so, again, the point isn't to go in and see if you can undermine the school or be, in opposition to your school. But you do have to understand that schools are dealing with a lot of difficult stuff and they have a lot of different pressures on them. Research isn't the only reason that leads to them buying a particular program or going a particular direction. And so it's critical that you be just smart about it and pay attention and ask why and why not. uh,
And I think there too, so being critical, but there's also, we know things that work. We know you read with your children, it matters. You mentioned background knowledge. We know that having conversations with your children matters. So there's lots of things out there that we
oh,
know parents can do.
there's a
And
ton of
so
things parents can do to help. Heck, I've run programs where we train parents in such things so that parents have ideas of what to do, and have shown that we can actually raise kids' reading achievement from the parent side by things that they do to help the school and to help their youngsters. So absolutely. But again, going with stuff that's been proven in research to actually work with families.
that's important. That's important. So it's the research side of things. So Tim, what does your study mean for researchers? How do we move the field forward?
I think researchers don't necessarily, I've seen at times when people read what I'm writing on these kinds of topics or saying on it, researchers going, well, I don't want to do that. I'm only interested in doing observational study. I don't want to try my stuff out and try to get people to do these things and have to test whether it works. That's not the kind of research that I want to do. I don't see that as a problem, but you have to see, I think we all need to see our role in research it's a very large enterprise, from basic research that's figuring out ideas that perhaps could affect instruction, to people who are actually saying, let's try these things out in classrooms and see how they work. And gee, if they do work, can we figure out some of those contextual factors that you were, touting a moment ago? Can we figure out the different conditions under which it'll work best, and so on? I do, over my career, I've done a ton of correlational research. I don't expect people to take that research and run into the classroom with it. I expect other researchers to pick that up and say, what if we tried that? How could we make that work? I think you have to look at that research enterprise. The peak of it is, gee, we've come up with something that seems to work pretty consistently and we know a lot about. We really think that should be adopted by schools. We want to see that fairly universal. That's, the part I gave was 6 years ago.
Now it's been explored
I
through
figured out
science instruction.
I figured out a pattern that might be important. Other people have built on that to actually show that, gee, he was right. It wasn't quite the way he thought, perhaps, but he got us to look at this, and it was really important. And now we've got it to the point where we can take it into classrooms and make it work pretty consistently with boys and girls. And therefore, we should do it because it's based on the science of reading and instruction. Yeah, his correlational stuff mattered,
But
it's
the subsequent studies.
absolutely. And I think we all have to look at our work in that way. So it's perfectly okay if you, as a researcher, you're not interested in doing randomized control trials, but you shouldn't expect your ideas to move into the classroom until somebody's done that, whether it's you or your students or your colleagues or whatever.
And even pairing randomized controlled trials with mixed methods so that you can get a better understanding of what is working and why it's working and how it's working.
Absolutely.
It's like a powerful piece there.
Absolutely.
So Tim, this is fascinating. What are some takeaway messages that we should leave this conversation with?
The science of reading includes studies of instruction. And when it comes to prescribing instruction, you shouldn't be doing that on the basis of non-instructional studies. You've got to wait till we actually try it out and see if it helps, or at least that it doesn't hurt. I think these days with the coronavirus crisis and so on, it's interesting. You know, there's no 6 months ago, the doctors could have had a vaccine out that they could have had people trying, you know, doing it nationwide, and they could have killed all kinds of people and might not have helped coronavirus. They had terrific ideas in March and April about how to come up with a good vaccine. And now they've just spent the last several months first trying to make sure that it isn't going to hurt people, and now trying to see if it actually is doing anything good for them. And once they're done with that, then we'll be ready to actually try that on scale. I think we need to get it in our head that we have that same kind of responsibility, that taking a really good idea into a classroom before it's actually ready to help children is a bad idea. And so yes, there's this huge science of reading, and reading instruction is part of that. But before we prescribe things, we ought to have tried them out. And that's to me, that seems so commonsensical.
It's important, you know,
important and not happening too often.
Well, I think it's what you said. It's so easy to want to get the shiny, the current, the quote unquote magic bullet, you know, and it's hard to, the good idea, it's hard to wait. I mean, the science of reading instruction is hard research to do. It's expensive. It's big. It's difficult. It takes a lot of staff, a lot of students, a lot of teachers, a lot of school support. And so it's hard to do, I think. And so I can see where we're grappling.
And the thing that should warn us off, and that's where I think that my article might help a little bit, is so, you know, I show historically so many times when we had great ideas that we were sure were going to make a difference, and it turned out that they didn't. In some cases, they did harm. In a lot of cases, they just didn't help. Charging up a hill that seems like a really good idea and turns out to be a bad idea, it's just not fair, especially for those children who come to school the farthest behind, you know, whose environments or their own, abilities mean that reading is going to be hard for them. And then we say, oh, but we want to take up a lot of the time because we've got a cool idea. We don't know if it's going to help them, but we think it will, is not the best way to go. The best way to go is, what are the things that we really know will help them?
Right.
Let's do those instead. And I think if our field would pull more in line with that, I think we'd make fewer mistakes. And I think in the long run, more kids would succeed.
I love it. And I'm leaving this conversation really, you know, re-emphasizing the value of the science of reading instruction and thinking about the role of basic research in fueling the science of reading instruction rather than it being the equivalent of the science of reading instruction.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You
guys are doing such a great job with RRQ. Keep it up.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being here and chatting with us about your study.
Thanks so much.
Take care.